March 8, 1935. Tokyo was wrapped in a brittle winter morning, the kind where even the air feels heavy with silence. Shibuya Station, usually alive with hurried footsteps and echoing train whistles, seemed to hold its breath. A thin dusting of snow from the night before clung to the cobblestones, crunching softly under the slow steps of early commuters. Something felt different. It wasn't just the cold. There was a stillness, a muted sorrow that seemed to ripple through the crowd. Even those who didn't yet know what had happened could sense that a chapter in their city's life had quietly, almost imperceptibly, closed. Near the station's main entrance, a small figure lay motionless. An Akita, his once vibrant golden coat now faded to a pale, patchy hue with the years. The sharp, intelligent eyes that had scanned every passing face for nearly a decade were closed. His chest no longer rose and fell. His watch, a vigil that had lasted longer than some human lifetimes, was finally over. His name was Hachikō. To the people of Tokyo, he wasn't just a dog. He was a fixture, as much a part of Shibuya Station as the tracks and platforms themselves. Day after day, through spring blossoms, summer heat, autumn rain, and winter snow, he had been there, waiting for the man who had once stepped off the train with a warm smile and a gentle pat on his head. Word spread quickly. Station employees abandoned their posts. Vendors stopped shouting their wares. Men in pressed suits slowed their hurried pace. Students clutched their satchels tighter. People gathered, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. They understood, in their own quiet way, that they were standing in the presence of something rare, the ending of a story that had bound strangers together for years. Among them was Hachikō Ueno, the longtime partner of Hachikō's late master, Professor Hidesaburō Ueno. She had loved the professor in life and, through Hachikō, had felt a lingering connection to him after his sudden death. Now, kneeling beside the old dog, she placed a trembling hand on his fur. It was coarse and cold, but to her, it still carried the weight of countless memories. Someone produced a large white cloth, and with the same care one might give to a family member, they wrapped Hachikō's body. There was no rush, no mechanical efficiency. Only slow, deliberate movements, as though they were afraid that speed would cheapen the moment. Tears streamed freely down the faces of people who had once passed him without a glance. The hardened businessman, the schoolboy with untied shoes, the elderly woman selling flowers. All were united now in a grief they couldn't quite explain. A photographer stepped forward, adjusting his camera with solemn precision. In the frame he captured, Hachikō lay in repose, surrounded by those who had witnessed his daily devotion. It wasn't just a picture. It was a piece of history, a frozen testament to loyalty and love that would outlive every person standing there. For 9 years, 9 months, and 15 days, Hachikō had returned to the same spot at Shibuya Station. He arrived at the same time every evening, his ears twitching at the sound of incoming trains, scanning the faces of passengers. Through sweltering heat, lashing rain, and snowstorms that would send most people running for shelter, he stayed, always waiting, always hoping. To a stranger, it might have looked like mere habit. But to those who knew his story, it was something deeper, a devotion that defied reason, a persistence that belonged to love, not logic. That morning, as the small procession carried Hachikō away, someone whispered, "This is the end, but he will never be forgotten." No one could have predicted how true those words would be. The photograph taken that day would travel far beyond Japan's shores. It would be printed in newspapers, studied by historians, and eventually find its way into the hearts of people across the world. It would tell the story of a dog who waited, and in waiting, taught humanity what it meant to be faithful. Shibuya Station would never again feel quite the same. The familiar silhouette at the entrance, the calm figure in the crowd, was gone. But in the quiet spaces between train arrivals, in the corners where he once sat, it felt as though his presence lingered. And somewhere, deep within the hearts of those who had passed him day after day, a legend was already taking root. One that would grow far beyond the boundaries of a single station or city, a story that would live on for generations. Spring 1924. Tokyo was slowly rebuilding itself after the devastation of the Great Kanto earthquake 2 years earlier. Streets bustled with activity, and the air carried the scent of fresh construction wood and blooming cherry blossoms. Life was returning to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such tragedy. At the Imperial University, a respected professor named Hidesaburō Ueno prepared for another day of lectures. Tall, lean, with a sharp mind and gentle demeanor, Professor Ueno was a man who valued precision, both in his academic work and in his daily routines. Each morning, he would walk to Shibuya Station, board the train to the university, and return at exactly the same time in the evening. It was a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock. But on this particular day, something would disrupt that rhythm and change his life forever. In the countryside of Akita Prefecture, a litter of Akita puppies had recently been born. Among them was one with a particularly distinctive look, small, pointed ears that seemed a bit too alert for his age, and deep, soulful eyes that gave the impression of an old spirit in a young body. He was curious, observant, and surprisingly calm compared to his siblings. This puppy was destined for something unusual, though no one could have guessed just how extraordinary his life would become. Through a series of connections, a friend of a friend who knew a breeder, and a mutual acquaintance who admired Professor Ueno, the puppy was offered as a gift to the professor. He had always loved animals, especially dogs, and the Akita breed held a special place in his heart for its intelligence, loyalty, and quiet dignity. When the small bundle of fur arrived in Tokyo, Ueno stepped out into his garden to meet him. The moment is difficult to describe without falling into the realm of fate. The puppy, still unsure of his new surroundings, looked up into the man's face. Ueno bent down, extending a hand. Instead of hesitating, the puppy stepped forward and touched his nose to the professor's palm, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. From that moment, they were inseparable. Ueno named him Hachi, meaning 8 in Japanese, a number considered lucky. It was a fitting name for a dog who would come to represent something timeless. Hachi followed Ueno everywhere. Around the house, into the garden, even waiting patiently while the professor prepared his lectures. The professor, in turn, cared for him as one would a family member. Their days settled into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Ueno would walk to Shibuya Station with Hachi trotting happily by his side. When the train arrived, the professor would step aboard, and Hachi would watch until the doors closed and the train pulled away. In the evenings, Hachi would return to the station, waiting among the crowd for his master to appear. Without fail, Ueno would step off the train, and Hachi's tail would wag in greeting before they walked home together. Neighbors began to notice the pair. There was something almost ceremonial about their daily commute. People would smile as they passed, sometimes stopping to give Hachi a friendly pat on the head. The station staff, amused by his punctuality, began referring to him as the professor's little shadow. Life, in those early years, was simple and full of small joys. Hachi grew into a strong, handsome Akita, his coat gleaming and his eyes bright. Ueno's affection for him was obvious, but it wasn't the indulgent love one might give a pet. It was the steady, respectful companionship of two beings who understood each other without words. It's tempting to look back on those days and imagine that they would last forever, but fate, indifferent to such hopes, had other plans. In May of 1925, just over a year after Hachi arrived in Tokyo, the morning began like any other. Ueno dressed for work, Hachi followed him to the station, and they exchanged their usual parting. The professor boarded the train, glancing back to see Hachi sitting dutifully by the platform. That image, the loyal dog watching his departure. Would be the last time they saw each other. Later that day, while lecturing at the university, Ueno collapsed. A cerebral hemorrhage claimed his life within hours. He was 53 years old. News of his death spread quickly, but no one thought to tell the dog, who was waiting patiently at Shibuya Station, eyes scanning every face for the one he loved most. That evening, when the train arrived without his master, Hachi waited. When the crowds thinned and the station lights dimmed, he finally returned home, only to repeat the same journey the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. What began as confusion slowly became ritual. The professor was gone, but Hachi kept waiting. To him, the world had not changed. Trains still came and went, and it was only a matter of time before the familiar figure stepped off once more. It was here, in this quiet and unshakable belief, that the legend truly began. In the weeks after Professor Ueno's death, Hachi's behavior puzzled everyone who saw him. At first, the professor's family tried to keep him at home, assuming the dog simply didn't understand that his master would never return. But Hachi resisted. Each morning, he slipped away, trotting with quiet determination to Shibuya Station. He would arrive before the evening train that used to bring Ueno home, sitting near the ticket gates with his head lifted and ears perked. Commuters recognized him. The same Akita who had stood there beside the professor almost every day for more than a year. But now he was alone, his gaze fixed on the arriving passengers, as if expecting to see that familiar figure step onto the platform. When the train came and went without the professor, Hachi stayed a while longer, scanning the thinning crowd. Eventually, when it was clear his master wasn't there, he would turn and walk away, but only until the next day, when he repeated the exact same ritual. At first, people assumed it would stop. Dogs, after all, adapt quickly. Surely he would move on once he realized Ueno wasn't coming back. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and still Hachi returned. Rain or shine, sweltering summer heat or biting winter wind, he was there, always at the same time, always watching. The station workers, who had known him during Ueno's lifetime, began to feel a quiet respect for the animal. They would bring him scraps of food, stroke his fur, and speak to him softly. Some even tried to coax him away, worried for his health. But Hachi would not be swayed. No matter how much kindness he received from others, his loyalty remained with the man who had once walked those steps beside him. Word of the faithful dog at Shibuya Station began to spread through the neighborhood. Children stopped on their way home from school to sit beside him. Vendors would glance up from their stalls to watch for his arrival, as if he were a train schedule all his own. By the second year, Hachi had become something of a local landmark. Newcomers to the station would be told, "If you see the Akita waiting, that's Hachikō. He's been looking for his master every day since 1925. Some people shook their heads, saying it was sad. Others smiled, calling it beautiful. But no one could deny there was something profoundly moving about the sight. Life around Shibuya Station was changing. The city was modernizing, with more electric lights, busier streets, and taller buildings. But Hachi remained constant, a living reminder of a quieter, more personal bond in an increasingly fast-paced world. By now, Professor Ueno's relatives had moved Hachi into the care of a former gardener who lived nearby. It was safer, and they hoped the familiarity of a home would comfort him. And yet, even from this new residence, Hachi found his way back to the station. His sense of direction was uncanny, and nothing, not snowdrifts, not pouring rain, could deter him from his post. By the mid-1920s, journalists began to hear of him. Local papers published small articles, "Dog waits for master," year after year. These brief mentions caught the public's imagination. In a city where people hurried through life, here was a creature who measured time not in hours or minutes, but in devotion. It was in 1932, 7 years after Ueno's death, that the story truly broke wide open. A former student of the professor, now a respected academic himself, wrote an article about Hachi for one of Japan's largest newspapers. In it, he described the unwavering loyalty of the Akita, who greeted each train as if it might carry his master back to him. The piece struck a chord across the nation. Letters poured in to the editor. People traveled to Shibuya just to see Hachikō for themselves. Tourists snapped photographs. Children clutched their parents' hands to get closer. Commuters who had once hurried past now stopped, if only for a moment, to acknowledge him. He became a living legend, a story parents told their children about love and loyalty. Yet for all the attention, Hachi himself seemed unchanged. Fame did not interest him. He didn't pose for photographs or perform tricks for the crowd. He simply waited, as he always had, eyes scanning each passenger who stepped off the evening train. There was an unspoken understanding among those who saw him daily. Hachi was not a curiosity to be gawked at, but a soul keeping a promise. The platform where he sat became a quiet place, even amid the bustle, a pocket of stillness where strangers shared in the simple, powerful truth of his vigil. As the years passed, Hachi's fur grew whiter, his frame leaner. Age began to slow his movements, but it did nothing to dull the alertness in his eyes when a train approached. The station staff built him a small shelter for cold or rainy days, but even then, he often chose to sit in the open, as if to make sure he wouldn't miss the moment his master returned. By the time he reached his 9th year of waiting, Hachikō was more than just a local story. He was a national treasure. A reminder, in a rapidly changing Japan, of the values people feared were being lost: loyalty, patience, and love without condition. And though he could not know it, his final winter was approaching, the last chapter in a life defined by a single, unbroken promise. By 1933, Hachikō was no longer just the dog at Shibuya Station. He had become a symbol, a quiet reminder of loyalty in a world that seemed to move faster with each passing year. His fame was no longer confined to Tokyo. Stories of him traveled across Japan, carried by newspapers, radio broadcasts, and word of mouth. For many, seeing Hachikō in person was almost like a pilgrimage. Families would plan a trip to Tokyo not just to shop or sightsee, but to stand on that platform and witness him in his vigil. Schoolchildren came in groups, their teachers explaining how this dog's devotion was an example of the virtues they should carry in life. Soldiers on leave stopped by, tipping their caps in respect. Even government officials quietly acknowledged the unusual ambassador that Shibuya Station had gained. The attention brought changes. Photographers jostled for a clear shot, reporters asked questions, and artists sketched him in charcoal and ink. His image began appearing in magazines, on postcards, even in children's books. For the Japanese public, weary of economic struggles and political tensions, Hachikō's story was a relief, proof that some things, at least, were constant and pure. But not everyone saw him through the same lens. Some skeptics whispered that perhaps people were projecting too much onto a dog, that Hachikō's behavior was just instinct, not a conscious act of loyalty. Others dismissed it as sentimentality in a time when Japan should be focused on modernization and strength. Hachikō, of course, paid no mind to debates or opinions. His world was simple: the station, the trains, the faces. He lived in the present, guided by a hope that was invisible to others but unshakable in his own mind. By now, his health was beginning to falter. Age was evident in the stiffness of his joints, in the way he lowered himself slowly to the ground. But when the train approached, his head would still lift, ears perked, eyes searching. Some days, when the weather was especially harsh, the station staff and local shopkeepers would insist he stay inside the small shelter they had built for him. Even then, Hachikō would position himself so he could see the passengers as they stepped onto the platform. In the spring of that year, the the city decided to honor him in a way no animal in Japan had ever been honored before. Sculptor Teru Ando was commissioned to create a bronze statue of Hachikō to be placed directly in front of Shibuya Station. The idea was simple but profound: to immortalize the loyalty of this dog so that future generations would know his story. The process took months. Ando visited the station multiple times, sketching Hachikō from different angles. Locals watched as the clay model took shape, noting how the sculptor captured the proud tilt of his head, the soft lines of his fur. When the statue was finally cast in bronze and unveiled in April 1934, a large crowd gathered. Hachikō himself was present. By then, he was older, his fur more silver than gold, but he stood quietly beside the statue as if recognizing, in his own way, that it was meant for him. The crowd erupted in applause, some people weeping openly. In that moment, Hachikō was no longer just an animal. He was a living monument. From that day forward, the bronze Hachikō became as much a meeting point as the real one. People would say, "Let's meet at Hachikō," and everyone knew exactly where to go. The statue and the dog shared the space, one unchanging and eternal, the other still arriving each evening to keep his silent promise. As the year wore on, Hachikō's fame continued to grow. His story began to appear in publications outside Japan, translated into English and other languages. Foreign visitors, curious about the loyal dog of Shibuya, stopped to take photographs, sometimes kneeling to pat his head. And yet, amid all the attention, Hachikō's life was still defined by its simplicity. He did not care for the cameras or the crowds. His purpose remained the same as it had been since 1925, to wait for the man he loved. By the winter of 1934, the signs of age were unmistakable. His once thick coat had thinned, and his eyes, though still alert, carried the softness of time. Those who saw him daily began to worry. They knew, though they rarely spoke of it, that his waiting would not last forever. Still he came. Even when the snow covered the platform, even when icy winds cut through the station, Hachikō arrived at his post. Passengers learned to step around him gently, careful not to disturb his vigil. The rhythm of Shibuya Station included him now, as essential as the trains themselves. In the final months of his life, Hachikō's story had become something larger than any one person could have imagined. It was no longer just about a dog and his master. It was about loyalty as a form of love, and love as something that could endure beyond death. What Hachikō could not have known was that his story was about to reach its final page, a chapter that would seal his place in history forever. The winter of 1935 was particularly harsh in Tokyo. Snow lay in thin, stubborn layers along the sidewalks, and the air bit through even the thickest coats. For Hachikō, now well into his twilight years, every step to the station was slower, every gust of wind a little harder to bear. Yet, the idea of staying home never crossed his mind. His purpose was as fixed as the tracks beneath the trains. On the morning of March 8th, the city stirred awake under a pale gray sky. Vendors began setting up their stalls, and the first commuters shuffled towards Shibuya Station, scarves wrapped tightly around their faces. Somewhere nearby, the familiar sound of claws clicking against pavement approached, steady, measured, and unmistakable. Hachikō was making his way to his post. Those who saw him that morning noticed he seemed more tired than usual. His gait was slower, his head slightly lowered, as though the years had finally caught up to him. But when he reached the station and settled into his usual spot, there was still that same quiet dignity in the way he sat, facing the platform, waiting. The morning trains came and went. Passengers hurried past him, some offering a gentle pat on the head, others leaving small bits of food at his side. A group of schoolchildren whispered to each other, pointing at the famous Akita with wide eyes. They had heard the story from their teacher, the dog who had waited for his master for a decade, and now they were seeing him in the flesh. By midday, a cold wind swept through the station, rattling the signs and sending a light flurry of snow swirling across the platform. Hachikō remained still, his gaze fixed on the place where the passengers emerged. Those close by noticed he seemed to be breathing more heavily than usual. A station worker approached and crouched beside him, speaking softly. Hachikō's ears twitched, but his eyes never left the tracks. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken and the chill deepened. It was then that Hachikō, for the first time anyone could remember, shifted away from his usual spot. Slowly, he walked toward the small shelter the staff had built for him years before. Inside, away from the wind, he lay down on the wooden floor. A few passers-by peeked in, concerned, but Hachikō seemed calm, almost peaceful. It is said that in those final hours, his breathing grew slower, his eyes half closing as if drifting into a dream. Whether he saw the professor's face in those moments, no one can know. But those who had cared for him all these years liked to believe that, in his mind, he was once again walking beside Ueno, hearing the sound of his footsteps, feeling the warmth of his presence. When the evening train arrived, the same one that had once carried Professor Ueno home, Hachikō did not rise to greet it. The platform filled and emptied, and the dog remained still. By the time the station quieted, the shelter was silent too. The next morning, March 9th, word spread quickly. Hachikō had passed away in the night, still near the place where he had kept his vigil for 10 years. People came from across the city to pay their respects. Flowers were laid in neat piles beside the shelter. Children wept openly, and even hardened commuters paused to bow their heads as they passed. The news hit the nation like a wave. Newspapers across Japan ran headlines mourning the faithful Akita. Some published long retrospectives of his life, reprinting the original photographs from his younger years alongside more recent images of his weathered face. The public's grief was genuine and widespread. In a time when people often felt disconnected from one another, the loss of this dog felt personal. On March 10th, a funeral was held at Shibuya Station. The crowd was immense. Students, laborers, soldiers, officials, and families all gathered in solemn silence. Buddhist priests in ceremonial robes chanted prayers, and offerings of flowers, incense, and food were placed around a framed photograph of Hachikō. In one poignant gesture, some mourners brought train tickets, as if symbolically granting him the ride he had been waiting for all these years. Those who had known him best, station staff, local shopkeepers, and the professor's old friends, stood closest to the front. Many wept openly. They were not just mourning a dog. They were mourning the embodiment of loyalty, the living proof that love can endure even after the world has changed beyond recognition. After the ceremony, Hachikō's body was taken to be preserved. Taxidermists worked carefully to ensure that his likeness would be kept for future generations to see. Today, that preserved form rests in the National Museum of Nature and Science in Ueno, Tokyo, a final tribute to a life that touched millions. But even more enduring than the preserved body was the story. The bronze statue outside Shibuya Station, unveiled the year before, became the centerpiece for annual gatherings on the anniversary of Hachikō's death. People still bring flowers to it every March, some bowing their heads in silent respect, others telling the story to their children for the first time. Hachikō's last mourning marked the end of a vigil that had spanned a decade, but it also marked the beginning of a legend. In the years to come, his story would cross oceans, inspire books and films, and become a timeless reminder of a truth humans sometimes forget, that love, once given freely, can outlast even death. In the days following Hachikō's death, the streets around Shibuya Station were lined with people bringing flowers, incense, and letters. Some were locals who had seen him every day. Others had traveled long distances just to say goodbye. For a week, the platform where he had sat for 10 years became an impromptu memorial, a place of both mourning and celebration. But something remarkable happened in the weeks that followed. The story didn't fade away. Instead, it began to travel beyond Tokyo, beyond Japan itself, carried by journalists and travelers who had been touched by the faithful Akita's vigil. The first sparks of international attention came from English-language newspapers in Japan, which published translations of the memorial articles. Western diplomats and expatriates living in Tokyo sent clippings to their families abroad. Before long, small columns about the loyal dog of Shibuya began appearing in newspapers across the United States, the United Kingdom, and even as far as Australia. Readers thousands of miles away, who had never set foot in Japan, were moved by the simple but powerful image, a dog who waited every day for his master, even years after the man's death. In an era before viral videos and social media, this was the closest thing to a global story, spreading slowly but steadily, carried by ink, paper, and human empathy. By the late 1930s, Hachikō's tale had been included in books about Japan, often as a cultural footnote to illustrate the values of loyalty and devotion that many associated with the country. Some writers compared his story to traditional Japanese legends, such as that of the warrior who remains at his post long after his commander has fallen. Others saw in Hachikō a universal truth, that love and loyalty are not bound by language, culture, or even species. Even during the turbulence of World War II, when Japan was engulfed in conflict, the memory of Hachikō endured. His statue at Shibuya Station was removed and melted down for the war effort in 1944, but people spoke of him quietly, almost protectively, as if his story were too sacred to be lost. When the war ended, Tokyo began the long process of rebuilding. Among the many projects proposed for the new era was a plan to restore Hachikō's statue. In 1948, a new bronze sculpture, crafted by the son of the original artist, was unveiled in the same spot. The ceremony was filled with emotion, not just for the return of the statue, but for what it represented: resilience, hope, and the bonds that survive even the darkest times. The second statue quickly became as beloved as the first. It was no longer just a marker for those meeting at Shibuya Station. It was a pilgrimage site for anyone who knew the story. Schoolchildren still came to lay flowers, and travelers from around the world added it to their itineraries. In the decades that followed, Hachikō's legend only grew. His story appeared in Japanese children's books, inspiring countless essays and school projects. It was adapted into plays, radio dramas, and eventually television specials. Each retelling reinforced the same simple truth, that love is measured not in years lived together, but in the willingness to wait. Even when waiting seems futile. Then came the films. In 1987, a Japanese movie titled Hachikō Monogatari told the story in full cinematic detail, introducing new generations to the loyal Akita. The film was a massive success in Japan, and for many viewers, it was their first time seeing the events portrayed in such a vivid, emotional way. But Hachikō's reach didn't stop there. In 2009, the story leapt onto the global stage with Hachi, A Dog's Tale, an American adaptation starring Richard Gere. While the setting was moved to a small town in the United States, the essence of the story remained intact: the daily vigil, the unbreakable bond, the bittersweet ending. Audiences around the world wept in theaters, and Hachikō's name entered the hearts of millions who had never heard it before. Suddenly, the bronze statue at Shibuya Station was more than just a local landmark. It was an international destination. Tourists from every corner of the globe made their way to that exact spot, some holding their own dogs in their arms, others standing silently with tears in their eyes. Hachikō's story even began to influence art and literature in ways no one could have predicted. Poets wrote verses inspired by his loyalty. Painters captured him in oils and watercolors. Musicians composed songs in his honor. And in the age of the internet, his face, often paired with quotes about love and loyalty, became one of the most shared images in the history of animal stories. But perhaps the most striking thing was how universal the reaction remained. In Tokyo or in New York, in a bustling capital or a quiet village, people responded to Hachikō's story the same way, with a mix of sadness, admiration, and hope. It was proof that some truths, devotion, loss, the longing for reunion, are understood instinctively by the human heart, no matter where in the world it beats. Nearly a century after he first began his vigil, Hachikō's image now lives not just in photographs and films, but in the minds of millions who never saw him in person. He is more than a story from Japan. He is a reminder to the world that love, in its purest form, asks for nothing in return, except the chance to wait, no matter how long it takes. Every March in Shibuya, as winter loosens its grip and the first hints of spring appear, a crowd begins to gather near the bronze statue outside the station. There are school children in neatly pressed uniforms, elderly couples walking slowly arm in arm, and tourists clutching cameras. They are all there for the same reason, to honor Hachikō. The annual memorial service is simple but deeply moving. Buddhist priests in saffron and maroon robes chant prayers, their voices rising above the hum of the busy station. Fresh flowers are placed at the base of the statue, lilies, chrysanthemums, even cherry blossoms if the season is early enough. People bow, some whispering words of gratitude, others simply standing in silence. What's striking is the mix of people. There are locals who remember seeing the real Hachikō as children, their memories faded but still vivid enough to bring tears. There are also visitors from other continents, many of whom first learned about the loyal Akita from books, documentaries, or films. The crowd speaks dozens of languages, yet they share the same reverent expression. In Tokyo, Hachikō is more than a statue. His story is taught in schools, featured in moral lessons alongside historical figures. Teachers use him as an example of perseverance and loyalty, values deeply rooted in Japanese culture but universally understood. Children grow up knowing his name as naturally as they know the names of heroes and explorers. Outside of Japan, his influence has taken on a life of its own. In 2015, a bronze statue was unveiled at the University of Tokyo, showing Hachikō joyfully reunited with Professor Ueno, a vision of the moment that life denied them. The statue stands in front of the agricultural department where Ueno once taught, and it has become a place of pilgrimage for students and dog lovers alike. Other countries have created their own tributes. In Rhode Island, USA, the American Humane Education Society erected a plaque telling Hachikō's story. In Woonsocket, a small memorial park features a statue of an Akita in his honor. Across Europe, murals and public art pieces depict him, often accompanied by captions like "Faithful until the end." But Hachikō's legacy isn't just measured in statues and ceremonies. It lives in the everyday actions he inspires. Animal shelters in Japan have reported that his story has encouraged more people to adopt dogs, especially senior animals that often get overlooked. Some owners even name their pets Hachi as a tribute, hoping to honor the kind of loyalty he embodied. His influence has also shaped the way people think about their relationships with animals. Hachikō's story blurs the line between pet and family member, showing that emotional bonds can run just as deep across species. In an age when many people feel disconnected from each other, his example serves as a reminder of the simple yet profound comfort that companionship can bring. The digital era has amplified his reach even further. On social media, his image circulates in countless forms: a photograph of him waiting at Shibuya Station, a still from the 2009 film, an artist's rendering of his final vigil. Accompanying captions often read like personal confessions. People sharing their own stories of loss, loyalty, and love, drawing strength from Hachikō's example. Some posts go viral, racking up millions of views. In the comments, strangers from opposite sides of the globe bond over their shared reaction. "I'm crying just reading this. He's the reason I adopted my dog. I want to be that loyal to the people I love." Hachikō's tale may have begun in a single train station nearly a century ago, but now it travels at the speed of light. In Japan, his presence in popular culture remains constant. There are children's books illustrated with soft watercolors, comic strips that retell his story with humor and heart, and even animated films that adapt his vigil into fantastical adventures. Companies have used his image in advertising, sometimes controversially, but always with the understanding that the public feels a personal connection to him. Even the busy, modern Shibuya crossing, one of the most famous intersections in the world, feels tethered to him. Every day, thousands of people pass within sight of his statue, and for a moment, some pause to look. In the chaos of flashing billboards and rushing crowds, the bronze dog stands still, a fixed point in a city that never stops moving. What makes his legacy so enduring is that it transcends time and place. Hachikō's story is not about Japan alone. It belongs to anyone who has ever waited for someone who didn't return, to anyone who has loved without expecting anything in return. It's a reminder that loyalty is not measured by convenience, but by constancy, by showing up day after day, even when hope grows thin. Nearly 90 years after his death, people still make the journey to see him. Some arrive smiling, some arrive with tears already in their eyes. They lay flowers, take photos, or simply stand quietly, letting the weight of the story sink in. And somewhere in that stillness, whether in Tokyo or in the heart of someone reading about him for the first time, the lesson remains the same: love endures. In the next part of his story, that love will continue to ripple outward, shaping not just how we remember one dog, but how we think about loyalty, compassion, and the quiet power of never giving up. Hachikō's story may have taken place in early 20th century Japan, but the loyalty he displayed has echoed through the decades, reappearing in the lives of countless animals and even humans. His vigil at Shibuya Station became a kind of template, a living metaphor for devotion that refuses to fade, no matter the passing of time. In Argentina, in the small town of Villa Carlos Paz, a German shepherd named Capitan made headlines in 2006 when he began sleeping beside his owner's grave every night. His owner, Miguel Guzman, had passed away suddenly, and the family noticed that Capitan had disappeared from their home. Weeks later, they found him lying in the cemetery, his head resting against the cool stone of the grave. Remarkably, Capitan had never been taken there before. Somehow, he had found the spot on his own. And for 6 years, he returned to it nightly, guarding it as though still waiting for his owner to come back. Across the ocean in Scotland, a small Skye Terrier named Greyfriars Bobby captured the hearts of Edinburgh in the 19th century. After his master, John Grey, passed away, Bobby spent 14 years sitting by his grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Rain or shine, winter or summer, he kept his vigil, fed and cared for by the townspeople who admired his steadfastness. Today, his statue stands just outside the cemetery gates, much like Hachikō's in Shibuya, a bronze reminder of loyalty that refuses to be forgotten. Even in the digital era, where stories can be exaggerated or manipulated, certain tales strike the same chord of authenticity that Hachikō's did. In 2011, as tsunami waters receded from the Japanese coastline, rescuers filmed 2 dogs standing amidst the wreckage, one injured, the other refusing to leave its side. The video spread across the internet, racking up millions of views within days. Commenters drew immediate comparisons to Hachikō, noting that the instinct to stay close to a loved one is as strong in animals as it is in us. But this isn't just about dogs. Humans, too, have shown Hachikō-like devotion in moments of unimaginable hardship. In wartime, there are stories of soldiers holding their post long after orders ceased, unwilling to abandon their comrades. In hospitals, family members spend months at the bedside of loved ones in comas, reading to them every day, hoping for a flicker of recognition. These acts mirror the same principle, that loyalty is not bound by reason, but by love. What connects all these examples is the emotional gravity they carry. When we hear about a dog who refuses to leave its owner's grave, or a parent who never stops searching for a missing child, it taps into something ancient within us. The belief that constancy is sacred, that showing up matters even when the outcome is uncertain. Hachikō's legacy amplifies these modern stories, giving them a deeper resonance. When Capitan in Argentina was finally laid to rest in 2018, newspapers worldwide referenced Hachikō in their headlines. Greyfriars Bobby's anniversary memorials often include mentions of the faithful Akita in Tokyo. Even in pop culture, when a fictional character demonstrates unshakable loyalty, writers and reviewers sometimes describe them as a Hachikō. And then there are the personal stories, the ones that never make the news, but live quietly in the lives of ordinary people. The elderly woman who walks to the park every day to sit on the same bench where she once met her husband. The man who keeps the porch light on for a son who hasn't returned home in years. The child who keeps a room tidy for a parent serving overseas, as if they might come back tomorrow. These moments may seem small, but they are bound by the same invisible thread that tied Hachikō to Shibuya Station. Psychologists have studied this kind of loyalty and found that it often transcends logic. It's not about what makes sense, it's about identity. For Hachikō, waiting was who he was. For Capitan, guarding the grave was his role in the world. For humans, acts of devotion often become a way of preserving the relationship itself, keeping it alive in memory, if not in reality. In this way, Hachikō is more than a story about a dog. He's a mirror we hold up to ourselves, asking, what and who am I willing to wait for? His life challenges the modern world's emphasis on speed and instant gratification. In an age when so much is fleeting, his example reminds us that some things are worth the long wait. It's no surprise, then, that educators and motivational speakers still use Hachikō's story today. In classrooms, it's told to illustrate virtues like perseverance and dedication. In leadership seminars, it's cited as an example of commitment that inspires trust. In art and literature, it's a motif. The lone figure who returns again and again to the same place, undeterred by the passing years. Even technology has found a way to preserve him. In virtual reality exhibits in Tokyo, visitors can meet a life-sized digital recreation of Hachikō, standing once again in front of Shibuya Station. Augmented reality apps let you place his statue in your own living room. These innovations may be modern, but the emotion they evoke is timeless. Hachikō's story doesn't just belong to history books. It lives in the choices people make every day to stay, to wait, to remember. It reminds us that while time changes everything, it cannot erase love given freely and held without condition. And perhaps that is the true measure of his impact. Not just that he waited, but that in doing so, he taught the rest of us what it means to stay faithful. There's a detail about Hachikō's story that people often overlook. He didn't know he was creating a legacy. He didn't understand that statues would be made in his image, that films would carry his name, or that strangers a century later would still speak of him. For Hachikō, every single day was just another chance, one more opportunity, to see his master walk through the station doors. That's the quiet truth about loyalty. It's rarely glamorous in the moment. It's repetitive. It's patient. It's made up of countless small choices that no one else may notice. Hachikō didn't wait for the applause. He waited for Ueno. That was enough. If you've ever stood at an airport arrivals gate, scanning the crowd for the face of someone you love, you felt a fraction of what Hachikō experienced. That rush of hope when the doors slide open, the small sting of disappointment when it's not them. And yet you keep looking, because maybe the next person will be the one. Now imagine feeling that for 10 years. The power of Hachikō's story is not just in the act of waiting, but in the emotional space that waiting occupies. It's the space where love turns into a ritual. His daily walk to Shibuya Station became as sacred as a prayer. Sitting by the platform was his offering. Watching the trains was his meditation. And in that space, time didn't diminish his devotion, it deepened it. This is where his tale touches something universal. Many of us carry our own versions of that vigil. We wait for apologies that never come, for people who left without explanation, for a moment we wish we could relive just once more. Sometimes, like Hachikō, we don't even realize how much of our life has been shaped by that waiting until years have passed. There's also a lesson here about presence. The people of Shibuya didn't just admire Hachikō from afar. They cared for him. They fed him, sheltered him, and kept him company. In return, he gave them a living example of constancy. That exchange created a community around him, a shared understanding that loyalty has value, even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, loyalty often reveals itself in these small acts. It's the friend who texts you every week even though you rarely answer. The neighbor who checks in when your porch light hasn't been on for a few nights. The nurse who remembers the name of every patient's family member. These moments might seem insignificant, but to the person on the receiving end, they can mean everything. Hachikō's devotion also invites us to think about loss in a different way. His vigil was born from absence, yet it wasn't defined by grief alone. There was love in it, active, visible love. Each day at the station wasn't just a reminder of what he had lost, but a celebration of what he had once had. In this sense, his waiting wasn't a refusal to move on. It was a way of keeping Ueno's presence alive. It's no coincidence that people often cry when they hear his story. They're not just mourning a dog. They're mourning the rare, unwavering loyalty he represents. In a world where commitments can be fragile and promises easily broken, Hachikō's steadfastness feels almost impossible, and yet it happened. He really did it. For 10 years. Through seasons, storms, and years that must have blurred together, he kept showing up. This truth cuts through the noise of history because it's simple. It doesn't require translation. Anyone, anywhere, can understand what it means to wait for someone you love. That's why his story has traveled so far, across languages and cultures, and why people who've never set foot in Japan feel as though they know him. And maybe that's the hidden power of his legacy. It turns us inward. It makes us ask uncomfortable but important questions. Who or what would I wait for, even when the world told me to stop? What promises have I kept when no one was watching? Have I been worthy of someone else's loyalty? Some might say that Hachikō's waiting was futile, that it kept him from moving on or living a full life. But that's a human projection. For Hachikō, the act itself was the point. Waiting wasn't something that happened to him. It was something he chose. And in that choice, day after day, he found meaning. His life is proof that love doesn't always have to be forward-moving. Sometimes it can be still, anchored in a single place, a single act, repeated until it becomes a kind of immortality. The bronze statue in Shibuya may be the public monument to his devotion, but the real monument was built in the quiet moments between trains, in the snow, in the rain, in the long stretches of ordinary afternoons. Even now, as commuters stream past that statue, some of them probably don't know the full story. They just see a dog sitting patiently. But maybe that's enough. Maybe in that single image, without words, they still feel something stir, a reminder that in a world obsessed with what's next, there's beauty in simply staying. It was a winter morning in March 1935 when the waiting finally stopped. Tokyo was in the last breath of cold before spring, the kind that makes your hands ache if you forget your gloves. People rushed through Shibuya Station as they always did, heads down, focused on catching the next train. Somewhere among them was Hachikō, older now, his once thick fur thinned, his movements slower, but his eyes still scanning every face. That morning, he took his familiar spot. Perhaps the air smelled different, or perhaps it was the same as always. No one can say for sure. What we do know is that sometime later that day, as the city moved on around him, Hachikō lay down and didn't get up again. The vigil was over. Word spread quickly. Locals who had fed him, sheltered him, and watched him through the years felt the loss like a physical blow. Some wept openly in the street. Newspapers carried the news across Japan within hours, their headlines reverent, almost as if announcing the passing of a national hero. In a sense, that's exactly what he had become. Hachikō was no longer just a dog. He was a symbol of something rare and unbreakable. His death was not just the end of a life. It was the closing of a chapter that had spanned an entire decade, touching thousands of lives along the way. The Japanese National Railways arranged for his body to be displayed at Shibuya Station, giving people a chance to say goodbye. The scene was unlike anything the station had ever witnessed. Crowds gathered in solemn silence. Some brought flowers. Others brought food as if he might still need it. Children clutched their parents' hands tightly, watching as grown men struggled to hold back tears. Among the mourners were station workers who had seen him every day for years. One of them, an elderly ticket clerk, was overheard saying, "It feels like losing a colleague." Another whispered, "I thought he would outlast us all." His body was preserved and placed on display at the National Science Museum of Japan, where it remains today, alongside photographs and personal items. This decision was controversial to some, but it ensured that future generations could see the real Hachikō, not just the statue, not just the story, but the physical presence of the dog who had waited. Even in death, his story grew. Artists painted him, poets wrote about him, and journalists from around the world told his tale. In an era before television and the internet, his image still managed to travel across oceans, carried in newspapers and word-of-mouth accounts. The loyalty of a single dog had transcended borders. For the people of Shibuya, the emptiness after his passing was palpable. The spot where he had waited felt wrong without him. The daily rhythm of commuters stepping around his sitting figure was broken. Some swore they could still see him in the corner of their eye, the way you catch sight of someone familiar in a crowd, only to realize they're not really there. And yet, even in absence, Hachikō continued to bring people together. The statue that had been erected in his honor while he was still alive became a gathering place, now layered with deeper meaning. Standing there, people could feel both the ache of loss and the warmth of his memory. Historians often note that timing played a role in the magnitude of his story. Japan in the 1920s and 30s was undergoing rapid modernization, and life in Tokyo was increasingly fast-paced. Amid that rush, Hachikō's quiet, unchanging vigil stood out as something timeless, a reminder of values that modernization could not replace. His death, therefore, felt symbolic, the end of an era where loyalty was lived in such visible, unwavering ways. There's a photograph taken shortly after his passing. It shows a small group of people gathered around his lifeless body, laid respectfully on a wooden platform. Someone has covered him with a cloth, and there are flowers beside his head. It's not a grand image, no crowds, no fanfare, but in its intimacy, it captures everything his story represents. Love, loss, the stillness that comes when a great chapter closes. But here's the truth. The day Hachikō died was not the day his waiting ended, because in a way he is still there. In every person who walks past his statue and pauses for just a moment. In every child who hears his story and asks, did he really wait that long? In every act of loyalty, great or small, that people perform without expecting reward. If we could speak to him now, Perhaps we would thank him not for the years he waited, but for showing us that such years are possible, for proving that devotion doesn't have to fade with time, for teaching us that love, in its purest form, is patient, even unto the end. The platform at Shibuya Station has changed since his time. The trains are faster, the crowds bigger, the neon lights brighter. But the spot where he once sat is still there, marked not by an official plaque, but by the collective memory of a city, and now, the world. As we move toward the final part of this story, we leave Hachikō there, in that moment, his vigil complete, his legacy just beginning. And we turn our gaze to the question his life leaves behind. In our own fleeting lives, what will we love enough to wait for? Hachikō's story doesn't really end at Shibuya Station. It never could. The truth is, legends don't stay rooted in the ground where they began. They grow, they travel, they take on a life of their own. And Hachikō's quiet vigil became more than a local curiosity, more than a tale told to children on a winter's night. It became a mirror in which people saw themselves, or at least the selves they wished to be. In the years after his death, his bronze statue at Shibuya became a meeting place. Couples would say, "Let's meet at Hachikō," as though invoking his name could guarantee they'd keep their promise. Friends would use it as a landmark, and strangers, unaware of the full story, would still sense there was something special about this particular spot in Tokyo. The image of Hachikō began to appear everywhere, in newspapers, on stamps, in school textbooks. His loyalty was used as a moral example, a standard to measure devotion against. And yet, for all the praise and fame, the essence of his story remained beautifully simple. A dog who loved his master enough to wait for him, long after the world would have expected him to stop. What's remarkable is how his tale crosses cultural lines. In a world divided by language, politics, and distance, loyalty is a concept everyone understands. Whether in a quiet village or a bustling metropolis, people know what it means to miss someone, to hope for their return, to keep a place for them in your life. That's why the story of one Akita from Tokyo could resonate with someone in New York, in Paris, in Nairobi, or in a small town far from any train station. There's a certain poetry in the fact that Hachikō never knew he was waiting for the impossible. To him, each day was fresh. Each arrival of the evening train was a new chance. There was no bitterness in him, no resentment toward the years that stretched on without his master's return. That purity of purpose is rare, even in humans. And maybe that's what unsettles us. Because if a dog can remain that true, what excuse do we have for giving up so easily? Today, tourists from all over the world pose for photos with his statue. They smile, they hold up peace signs, they post the images on social media. Some of them know the story, some don't. But for those who do, standing there can feel unexpectedly emotional. The hustle of Shibuya's famous crossing fades for a moment, and you can almost hear the faint sound of a train arriving in the distance, carrying the shadow of a man who will never step onto the platform. Even in the digital age, where attention spans are fleeting and stories are consumed in seconds, Hachikō's tale demands a slower pace. It asks us to sit with it, to let it settle in. Because this isn't just about a dog. It's about what it means to choose love over convenience, constancy over distraction. It's about the quiet, steadfast commitments that often go unnoticed, and how they can become the most powerful legacies of all. When you walk away from this story, it's hard not to think about your own life. Who, or what, would you wait for, even when everyone else told you to stop? Have you been the person who waited, or the one who left? And if you left, was there someone who kept looking for you long after you were gone? The truth is, we all want to believe we are worth waiting for. That someone, somewhere, would stand in the same place day after day, just in case we came back. Hachikō reminds us that such loyalty is possible, but also that it's rare and precious and worth protecting when we find it. And so, the next time you pass through a station, or an airport, or even a quiet street corner where someone stands alone. Remember the old Akita in Shibuya. Remember the years he spent watching the crowd for a face he would never see again. Remember that in those years, he created something no one could take from him. A love that outlived its object, a devotion that became a legend. Hachikō's vigil may have ended on that cold March day, but his story still waits for us. In books, in films, in the bronze eyes of his statue, and in the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, we can be as faithful to the people we love as he was. Because in the end, the lesson he leaves us with is not about loss. It's about presence. It's about showing up again and again, even when there's no reward in sight. And if we can carry even a fraction of that into our own lives, then Hachikō's wait was never in vain.